Welcome to the Aging Boomers. I'm your host, Frank Sampson. Of course, on our show, we discuss so many of the issues that are facing boomers, their parents, and what we know, of course, is an aging population. And I want to just thank everybody for all their support. So many of you have gone on to iTunes or Stitcher, Spreaker, iHeartRadio, and just put your information in. You get up to date on all of our shows and all the interviews with some great people. Of course, I would say that probably most of you just download our free app, which you can do on your iPhone, Android phone. Just go to your app section, type in the Aging Boomers, download it for free, and you can get up to date information on all the shows. I want to remind everybody that today's show is sponsored by Senior Care Authority, a professional senior placement and elder care management organization that has a national network of advisors to help in determining the right path for senior living and receiving proper care. So whether it's in-home care, assisted living, residential or memory care, or you just need an advocate to kind of help you through the process, you can get the necessary advice you need from a senior care advisor in your area by calling Senior Care Authority at 888-809-1231, or you can go directly to the website at www.seniorcareauthority.com. And there's a number of reasons that I was really looking forward to today's guest, but we're talking about a real important subject matter. I like to introduce Stan Goldberg, who has his PhD as Professor Emeritus of Communicative I got to get my communicative disorders at San Francisco State University, and author of a brand new book just coming out, Loving, Supporting, and Caring for the Cancer Patient. He is a prolific award-winning writer, editorial consultant, and recognized expert in the area of cancer support, end-of-life issues, caregiving, chronic illnesses, aging, and change. Stan has more than 300 publications, presentations, workshops, and interviews. He's garnered 22 national and international awards for his writing. And it's just a pleasure to have you on the Aging Boomer, Stan. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Frank. I'm honored to be on your show.
Yeah, so, an important subject and, kind of the topic of our discussion today, I guess I'll get right to the point. All right. What would you recommend someone do and say to help adjust to the news of a cancer diagnosis to a loved one?
Yeah. In a number of workshops that I've done, that the question I ask people, is what would you immediately say when someone says to you, "I have cancer"? And the responses I would say maybe 80 to 90% of the responses were all the same. And it was, "I'm so sorry to hear that," or some other expression of compassion. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's spoken from someone's heart. But the person with the cancer diagnosis is going through some incredible changes. The first thing is to tell another person that they have a life-threatening illness is not something that's just blurted out, but rather there's a lot of thought going into there. The person is assuming the position of a vulnerable person, someone whose lifespan may be shortened. And even though they would like to hear, or they are very accepting of compassionate thoughts, what they need to hear more is specific things that their loved one or friend is willing to do for them. And that's what I went through. I was diagnosed with cancer 13 years ago. And I was, very judicious in who I revealed that diagnosis to. And what I found in retrospect, looking back, is the most helpful responses were ones that were specific. And it could be something as simple as, someone says to you, I have cancer and I'm going in for treatments and, I'm going to be weak afterwards. Instead of giving a general response such as, if you need anything, call, a much better approach is to be specific, such as, I know you're going to be weak after your treatment. What time should I be here Thursday morning to take you shopping? So that's the important place to begin. It's never about trying to find the right words, because there will be no right words. But it's trying to find something that the person with cancer can hold on to and say, yeah, here's a person who's willing to be with me on my journey.
That's great suggestions. I know that things have changed where people might have gone into the hospital for certain treatments, whether it be chemo, radiation, whatever the case may be. But now, I guess people are more going into, outpatient, and getting treatments. I mean, do you? What's your thoughts on somebody saying, I want to be with you while you're having this treatment? Is that going a little too far, or that kind of depends on the relationship?
Well, I think, yes, it depends upon the relationship, but I don't think it's going too far. I know with a client that I counseled a couple of years ago, what she said to me was, and I had asked her, I said, what was the most supportive thing that happened to you in this cancer journey of yours? And her response was, my friend sitting next to me while I was getting chemotherapy, and just sitting there and being willing to hold my hand. So I think that anything that concretely expresses the willingness of someone to be with you on this cancer journey is not only appropriate, but is wonderful.
I'd like to get into a little bit of statistics, not that we have to be exact, but I remember my grandfather, he had, cancer, and I remember people didn't even want to say the word. It was the C word, all right? And things have changed quite a bit. And it's not a death sentence anymore. Obviously it depends on the type of cancer, when it's diagnosed, etc. But tell us a little bit about kind of the changes. I guess more upbeat news is what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
For people that may have been diagnosed with some form of cancer.
Yeah, modern medicine is terrific. I'm 13 years post-diagnosis. 20 years ago, if I had developed cancer then, I would have been dead. So there are new changes that's extending the lives of people with cancer. And sometimes it can extend it to the point where other issues will take someone's life. But I think what gets lost in the optimism, and I am optimistic, I hope I will live another 10 years, but what gets lost is because we are able to live longer with a debilitating disease, we need to think what's necessary to adapt. And I think that tends to be overlooked. I mean, I never talk about myself as a survivor. That implies a win or a losing situation. I know that until I die, I will need to deal with my cancer. And the way that I do that is to adapt. When I'm tired, I understand what's going on, and I slow down. When I'm feeling terrific, I know that I can do things otherwise I couldn't do. So it's that adaptation that I think people are still ignoring. When they think, I'm going to live much longer now because modern medicine allows that. And it's true, but these are the issues that make life, acceptable, miserable, or neutral. So it's that adaptation, the coping, that I think is getting lost.
Right. So, going back to what you were saying about, being a little more specific with people when you, hear about this, I know I was fortunate enough to get kind of an advanced copy of your book that's just coming out, and one of the things you did talk about is about actions or, maybe being more important than even words. So talk to us a little bit about your thoughts there.
Well, one of the things that I lost following the cancer diagnosis was my ability to go alone into the wilderness and fly fish, and it was something that was an important part of my life. I would do it quite often, and so I would stay out for 2 weeks. Well, I couldn't do that alone anymore, and so what people did is, instead of telling me how terrible what it was I was experiencing, they offered to take me out into the wilderness, which would defeat the whole purpose of going to the wilderness, was to be alone. But they also offered to take me fishing with a bucket of worms at a nearby fish and pay place. Well, that one could look at that as thinking that was insensitive, but it wasn't. It was a very specific action that someone offered, and I accepted it and sat there with worms and a can of beer and sitting in a lawn chair and fished. So it's the intent that's more important than the actual behavior. And I think, those of us living with cancer know the difference.
Right. No, that's important. Because some people, once you say, they just have a tough time expressing their thoughts. They do, but there's also this fear. As a society, we look at death as being something separate from life, and if we can maintain that separation, we can hold off on thinking about death forever until something like cancer, which is life-threatening, occurs. And when that happens, we're afraid. I know that shortly after my cancer diagnosis, I had people afraid to ask me how I was doing because they were afraid of hearing that I wouldn't be around much longer. So, I think that fear often prevents people from saying and doing things that could be very helpful. I've never had cancer, and I hope it remains that way the rest of my life. But I try, even though it's difficult, to try to put myself into someone's shoes when they hear that news. And I guess I would want to know from the doctor, well, either how much time do I have? What's kind of the outlook here? And many times, you hear people that say, well, they've got, a year, they got 6 months, they got 2 years, whatever the case may be, which is, I know, an opinion, probably based on historical data, I would think. And many times people go far past that period of time. So what's your thoughts when you hear that type of information about somebody, that they were given a time period? I was a hospice volunteer for 8 years. So I was able to be with people that had a formal, terminal diagnosis, and everyone had been given predictions of how long they would live. Very rarely is it accurate. It's such a wide range that, to tell someone you only have 2 years to live or you have 3 years to live isn't very helpful. And that's what we tend to be stuck on. Instead of thinking about how much time I have left, because this is something that I needed to do, I think about what can I do to make this day as good as it can be, given the fact that I don't know
how much longer I have. It's a very different approach. And it's one that involves balancing reality and hope. Now, for me, that's the approach that works. For some people, that is too direct and too honest of an approach. A friend of my mother had stomach cancer. It was obvious to all of her friends that she was dying, but this was a woman who was afraid of death and never would talk about it. So for her, it was important. It was the compassionate thing for people not to tell her how little time she had left. So it's different for everybody. The most successful approaches I've seen are one that balances hope and reality.
So what suggestions do you have for those in the medical community, physicians themselves, who have to relay this information to their patient?
Yeah. Physicians have gotten a lot better over the past 10 years. There was a period of time when, physicians felt conveying a terminal diagnosis to patients resulted in less time that they would have. And, the research has shown that's not true. It has no direct, relevance to that. So what I'll contrast two physicians that I had and a different approach. When I was first diagnosed, the physician was very reluctant to tell me what my prognosis was. But I had done enough reading, and I knew that with a Gleason score of 8 or 7, I was close to having a form of cancer that would be difficult to control. So I knew that, and yet he would not deal with the possibility that I would die. I currently have an oncologist who has a 180-degree different view. And his approach, and he was very specific with me, he says, I would like to keep you alive as long as I can in the best quality of life that's possible. Now, to me, that's the perfect balance of hope and reality. And I would hope that other physicians could go the same way.
Right. Now, that's a good approach. I like that. So what about dealing with a loved one who is going, through treatments? They've got side effects. They've got discomfort. They have pain. How do you suggest to, family caregivers, loved ones, to deal with those types of situations?
I think people need to start with the following assumption. And that is, the life of a person living with cancer will be different than the life that you're leading. And it also differs significantly from their pre-diagnostic life. So we start with an understanding that we're dealing with two different ways of perceiving the world. And that involves, the result is a better understanding of what that cancer patient is going through. Quite often, people who don't have cancer have expectations of the person with cancer. And a lot of those expectations are based on what that person was able to do prior to the diagnosis. I had a patient that I worked with who, prior to her cancer diagnosis, was the most compassionate person in the world. She cared for other people's feelings. She offered help. She did a lot of things that suggested that here was a very giving person. With her diagnosis of stage 3 breast cancer, her life now became something that she needed to re-examine and prioritize. So, all of a sudden, people who didn't realize what she was going through viewed her what they perceived to be a sort of a coldness in how she would react to situations that in the past she appeared to be compassionate about. So that's the place to begin. You're living in two different worlds, and before making judgments about the intent of someone who lives with cancer, the intent of their words or behaviors, try to understand what they're going through. In their minds, they don't know how long they have to live. They don't know whether they've made a significant contribution to the world. They don't know, how people are going to react to them. So in this very confusing world, it's very easy to misinterpret what they say and do.
So, decision making. Let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, I'm sure that there are patients out there that have cancer, and they might be a little, confused or whatever, but they, still want to make decisions and be independent and all of that. What happens in a situation where, your loved one that has cancer is, making certain decisions that you may not totally agree with? Is that something, how do you handle that type of situation?
Well, I had to go through that with my brother-in-law, who died of brain cancer. Mm-hmm. And he was making decisions that I thought were ludicrous. He had already had one major operation to remove as much of the tumor as possible. And with glioblastomas, it's very difficult to remove everything. So I knew that the likelihood that any additional treatment would be beneficial was minimal. And yet he found, and this is on the internet, a procedure, a surgical procedure that almost guaranteed that he would get rid of the tumor. And I knew it was a scam. So the question is, what can I do to convince him that this wasn't a proper approach? Well, I realized I couldn't, because he was holding on to this procedure as his last hope. And there was no way that I was going to convince him to not have the operation. What that did was what many caregivers have to go through constantly, and that's, despite believing your loved one is making a mistake, instead of withdrawing, you need to be there to support it, even knowing that this is a disastrous choice. And that happens a lot. It's unfortunate, but sometimes, in chronic illness and in end-of-life issues, we are left with only being able to sit there, literally, figuratively, hold our loved one's hand and support them. So that's something I think is very difficult for caregivers to accept.
What if you, in the situation you just said with your brother-in-law, mm-hmm. right? He went, going through a surgery that you were pretty confident it wasn't going to help him, okay? But mm-hmm. what if it was going to make the situation worse? Would you push harder?
I probably wouldn't. Actually, I'm referring it back to that situation. I didn't, because I knew, I pushed as hard as I could without destroying the trust he had in me. And because trust is a real important variable to protect with someone who has cancer. We are vulnerable, incredibly vulnerable. And sometimes the most important thing for us is to trust you. If someone is arguing with me and telling me what a terrible decision I'm making and is being very strong about it, I may not trust them as much after that discussion ends. So, I would say use whatever factual data is available, and I do that, and I suggest that to the caregivers I counsel, that, use that kind of data. It's more important to say, look, this is what the AMA says about this procedure. That's a more appropriate approach than saying you must be an idiot to believe that this is a legitimate way to deal with cancer.
Right. Okay. So I got one more question for you, and then I want you to tell our listeners more about your book, how they can get it, so I want to make sure we leave time for that. But
okay,
some of the hard conversations, you certainly talked about one that you had with your brother-in-law, but like you said earlier, everybody's different. Some people would probably, some will openly talk about it, the chance that they, could die sooner than planned, and they openly talk about it. Others kind of clam up and are fearful of death and won't discuss it. So how do you deal with that if somebody who does clam up, and it's important for the loved one that they need to talk about it, so at least the loved one can understand their wishes and all of that, but they clam up? How do you deal with that?
Well, I think that there's a couple different approaches, a short-term and a long-term. The short-term approach is one that I learned during my 10 years of hospice work. In those 10 years, I never brought up the topic of dying with my patients, even though they obviously knew they were dying since they were in hospice. Yet every single one of them knew, at some time, what started that discussion. And they didn't start the discussion because I or anyone else pushed them, but rather they were ready to talk about it. I think the same thing applies to people with cancer, even though it's non-terminal. Having cancer involves loss. And someone who is continually experiencing losses has a need to talk about that. So if you feel that your loved one is avoiding dealing with certain issues, then you can bring it up tangentially. So, for example, I had counseled a woman. She and her husband had been planning it was a backcountry trip or something. I'm not sure exactly. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was something that would have definitely taxed his ability severely. And instead of his wife saying to him, this is a terrible idea, we have to cancel this, what she did was to just very factually go over all the things that were necessary to do the trip. So it was like, we've got to walk 6 miles a day with the rest of the group. And I noticed you were having difficulty walking around the block last week. Do you think we may want to think about changing it? So that was one approach. That's the short-term, immediate approach. The long-term approach it's cultural. It has to do with our unwillingness to look at death as anything other than, an uninvited, embarrassing relative. We don't want to deal with it. We don't want to see it. Yet in some countries, they deal with death as a part of living, and when situations occur that are life-threatening, the drama isn't nearly as great. And it's one simple example. When I was in Japan, I would see a cemetery next to a dress shop, next to another cemetery, next to a candy store. So even physically in some countries, death is viewed as a part of living. And I think in long-term trends, I think that's what we need to start doing.
Great advice. I could talk to you for a while longer, certainly, about this subject matter. You've been a wealth of information. Speaking about a wealth of information, I'd love you to talk about your book. Tell us more about it, how people can get it. It's wonderful. So It's commercial time. Go ahead.
Okay. The book is called Loving, Supporting, and Caring for the Cancer Patient. It can be ordered now on Amazon or any of the other booksellers, and it will be released on October 16th. So you can put in your order now and know on that date it's going to come to you. The genesis of this book was the difficulties that I encountered when I was diagnosed. So it's based on not only my issues, but what cancer patients over the last 10 years have told me worked for them and what didn't. I also, on my website, StanGoldbergWriter.com, There are a wealth of articles, probably over 200 articles, maybe a quarter of which deal with cancer. They're all free. They're downloadable. You can send them to friends and relatives, and that's there. And also on that site, there are many other books that I have written, which would take too long to get into, that relate with the issues of cancer, acute illness, end of life, aging.
Great. Dr. Stan Goldberg, thank you so much for joining us. Great information, and go to his website, stangoldbergwriter.com. Learn more about his book. You could go on Amazon as well, and a lot of great information to share. So, so Dr. Goldberg, thank you, and I want to thank everybody out there for joining us. And just be safe out there, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Okay, thanks, Frank.
Thank you.